Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Cassidy Avila with the Center for Optimizing Rural Health at Texas A&M University. Welcome to our monthly webinar. The topic this month is Hospital Boards 101, and today's presenter is James Orlikoff. Mr. Orlikoff is president of Orlikoff & Associates, an international consulting firm specializing in healthcare governance and leadership, strategy, quality, and patient safety, as well as organizational development. He's been involved in leadership, quality, and strategy issues for over 30 years. He's worked extensively on improving the relationships between boards, medical staff, and management. And he's written over 15 books and over 100 articles and has served on hospital, college, and civic boards. So we're very pleased to have him with us today. It's going to be an excellent presentation, and we thank you for being on this webinar. You are set to mute at this time, but please go ahead and use the chat functionality if you have any questions, and we will address those at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Mr. Orlikoff, just so that we have plenty of time for your presentation and questions at the end. So welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, and hello, everybody. And let us jump in, as we're going to cover a very exciting topic in a brief period of time. And first, let me start by just saying thank you to all of you who choose to volunteer to serve on a hospital board. It is very, very challenging, very complex, but it's also very rewarding and perhaps most importantly, very important. So let's jump into some of the materials. First, just need to point out that this webinar is indeed supported by the Health Resources and Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The content of this presentation is mine and does not necessarily represent the official views of nor an endorsement by HRSA, HHS, or the government of the United States. So with that, let us jump in, and here's a wonderful quote from Peter Drucker, who said, "Even small healthcare institutions like rural hospitals are complex, barely manageable places. Large healthcare institutions may be the most complex organizations in human history." So let's start there. Your hospital, your rural hospital, may be smaller than the business in which you work. It's probably certainly much, much smaller than companies you may own stock in. But odds are it's much more complex. And why is it more complex? And there are several reasons for this, many of which relate to the governance nature of it. And so let's just focus on that. The hospital, the simplest standalone hospital, has a very complex leadership model. And so let's compare this to, say, a stock corporation. Any company that any of you own stock in basically has two leadership groups, the board and management. And all they have to do is kind of figure out what the difference is between the roles of those two entities. A hospital, a simple, rural, standalone, small hospital, has a leadership structure which is an order of magnitude more complex in that it has at least three leadership groups: board, management, and medical staff. And there are only several types of organizational structures that have three leadership groups. Hospitals are one, colleges and universities are another, where you have board, management, faculty, and arts organizations like symphony orchestras or ballets are a third, where you have board, management, and then the group of artists. And in each of these organizations, what's unique is that the board has the responsibility to oversee the quality of the medical care for a hospital, the quality of education for a college, and the quality of the artistic experience for an arts-based organization. So incredibly complex, and many of us aren't satisfied with that. Many of you listening to this come from organizations where you don't just have a single board. You may have more than one board if you have a foundation board, or you have a for-profit board, or you have some type of other entity which requires a board. So you have perhaps multiple boards as well. So the complexity of healthcare is not just limited to, what is understandably and universally recognized as being a very complex business model. You're a charity which has to compete like a business. You've got government regulation, but market-based competition. You have multiple payer sources, and all of this magnifies the complexity. But the complexity of the organizational structure is key as well. So let's kind of examine where that came from, and let's go back to where it all started, because many of us have models of governance which kind of relate to the origin of hospital governance. And you're all in very good company because the first hospital trustee in the United States was Benjamin Franklin, who founded the first hospital in Pennsylvania in 1752. And in doing so, he created the first hospital board and a model of hospital governance, which stayed in effect for over 250 years. And this model basically, as you can see in front of you, was a house divided. On one side of the house, you had the board, and the board was responsible for non-medical services, equipment, finance, and supplies, and they largely delegated this to management. And on the other side of the house, you had the medical staff, and they were responsible for both providing medical care and presumably for the assessment of that care and the improvement of that care. But what's very, very significant here is that you don't see a hierarchical relationship, a superior-subordinate relationship between the board and the medical staff. They were separate, co-equal authorities. And how long did this last? This lasted from 1752 until 1965. And what changed it was a very famous malpractice case in the state of Illinois called the Darling versus Charleston Memorial Community Hospital case, where the Illinois Supreme Court found that, and this is a quote from the ruling, modern-day hospitals do far more than simply furnish facilities for treatment. When a patient avails himself of the services of a hospital, he expects that the hospital, at a minimum, will endeavor to protect him from injury, and equally importantly, will be an active participant in making him well. And then here was the phrase that changed everything. The public must be protected. From whence does this protection come? It comes from the Board of Trustees. And that ruling basically changed the legal organizational structure of the hospital from what you see in front of you to this. And what you see here is that the board is now responsible for everything. Not only oversight of management, but also oversight of the medical staff, also quality of care, medical staff credentialing. Now, it's also very important to point out here that many board members, when they think about their responsibility to oversee the medical staff or for quality, assume it can be delegated to management, and it cannot. You'll notice in this organizational structure, it's not a single line that goes board, management, medical staff, but rather it bifurcates, and you have management reporting to the board for certain issues and the medical staff reporting to the board for other issues. So it's very, very important to understand this organizational structure because many board members think, well, our job is to take care of finance, and it's the medical staff's job to take care of quality, and that's not the case. Or they think we can hold management accountable for making sure the medical staff has an effective credentialing program, and that's equally not the case. And incidentally, just back to the history, why did a case in Illinois in 1965 have such a major impact? And the answer is because right around that time that case was occurring, and the Illinois Supreme Court ruled on it, Medicare was being implemented. And the writers of the Medicare regulations said, well, gee, we're going to be dumping all of this money into hospitals for Medicare. We have to have some accountability for quality. Who will be responsible for quality? And they said, oh, look what just happened in Illinois. Let's make the board the ultimate accountable authority for quality. So the Medicare regs, and they still exist to this day, called the Conditions of Participation in Medicare, identified that the board is the ultimate accountable authority of the hospital generally, and specifically is responsible for oversight of the medical staff and oversight of quality. By the same token, in about 3 years after the Darling case and after Medicare passed, by about 1968, every hospital licensing statute in the United States, every state statute, was changed to say that it is the board that bears the ultimate accountable authority. So you, my friends who are serving on your local rural boards, are the ultimate authority for everything that goes on with the hospital, that goes on inside the hospital, including quality, safety, and oversight of the medical staff. And so thinking about the evolution of governance, you see that we kind of went from that Franklin model, which we refer to as the honorific philanthropic model of governance. And the reason we do that is because boards during this time period, which basically functioned under this organizational structure, only had really kind of two responsibilities, and that was to give money and to attract philanthropic donations and to confer honor to the organization by their presence on the board. So boards would seek people who had money or access to money or who knew people with money, and they would seek people who had great stature professionally or academically or politically or socially in the community to try to kind of give the hospital a high level of stature in the community. Following the Darling case, and from about 1965 to 1983, I refer to this as kind of the wink-wink model of governance, and that's because the law changed and the board was now legally responsible, as I described to you earlier, but many, many boards still behaved as though they did prior to 1965 and the Darling case and the Medicare regs. It wasn't until about 1983 when we enter what we refer to as the good governance model. And this was marked by a major change in the payment system under Medicare called the Prospective Payment System, or PPS, which involved the change in the way hospitals got paid so that they now got paid based on diagnostic-related groups, or DRGs. Prior to this, hospitals had a cost-plus model of reimbursement under Medicare, which actually and perversely rewarded them for being inefficient. Now, suddenly, they were punished for being inefficient, and everything began to change as the payment model changed. And it was at this time that people began to think, wow, everything in the hospital has to change. We have to tighten up our reporting systems, our medical record systems. We have to begin a very, very challenging process, which many of you are still working toward, to standardize the care in terms of quality and cost that's being provided within our hospital. So everyone in the organization has to change. And so people began to think, well, gee, maybe the boards need to change as well. Can boards have an impact on hospital performance? And it was during this time that we started to see the first data which showed, yes, boards have a tremendous impact on how their hospitals perform, not just in terms of financial performance, but also in terms of performance on quality measures and safety measures. In fact, there is data that shows that a hospital board that spends, at least 25% of its single most precious commodity, which is its time together on quality and safety, will have statistically significantly lower severity-adjusted mortality rates than hospital boards where the boards spend less than 25% of their time on quality and safety. So it was here that we began to get our first inklings that, wow, governance really matters, and good governance can really make a difference. But it wasn't until the 1990s when the markets began to tighten further. The reimbursement models came under more pressure. Hospital finances began to deteriorate. When we began to see hospitals consolidating into systems, and we began to see the first wave of mergers and system formation, which then kind of brought us to where we are today, where we see, multi-state systems and national systems of healthcare. And this is where we kind of entered the best governance practices, where people were saying, don't tell me what good boards do. What do great boards do? And how can we propel boards to maximum governance efficiency so that we can deal with a rapidly changing and radically challenging healthcare environment to continue to prosecute our mission. And now what some of us are thinking about is, well, what's the next model of governance likely to be? As you have, multi-billion-dollar, multi-state systems, might it require a different model of governance? But that's a topic for a different webinar. So let's go back now. So most of you in this room are hopefully out of the wink-wink model. You're at least into number 3, the good governance model, and hopefully in stage 4, the effective governance best practices model. So let's consider some things now. What makes boards unique? Because boards are absolutely fascinating creatures. So here's kind of a primer on governance, both from a legal perspective and also from a social organizational kind of decision-making group process dynamic perspective. So number 1, a board only exists when it is meeting. So what does this mean? It means that the single most precious commodity that a board possesses is its time together. The second thing it means is that the only work of the board can be done during a board meeting. So when a board meeting is adjourned and the board members leave, the board cannot take action. unless it's delegated authority to take action to an executive committee. Now, this is very, very important because what it means is if 3 board members see the CEO after a meeting and say, you should do this or you should do that, they are not speaking on behalf of the board. They cannot be. They're not giving a directive on behalf of the board. The board only exists when it is meeting. Number 2, the board is a singular entity. It is a singularity. It is not a collection of individuals. Put a different way, from a legal perspective, a board is an is, it is not an us. Now, what does this mean? Let's say that your board is got 15 members, and let's say I'm the chief executive officer of your hospital. How many bosses do I have? And the answer is I do not have 15 bosses. The answer is I have only one boss, the board, and it's the board's responsibility to speak to me with one voice. And this kind of brings up one of the great challenges of governance. How can you take a board of, say, 15 people who have different opinions, different perspectives, have them debate with many different voices, but then have them come to a decision and then speak with one voice? And that's really the art of governance. And this is very, very important to understand. From a legal perspective, the law regards you as either a member of the board or not. So there have been lawsuits where boards have been sued, and individual board members have asked the court to excuse them from the case. And the argument they made was, I voted against the motion, which got us in trouble. Or I argued against this, and I said we shouldn't do it. Look at the minutes. And invariably, the court will say, well, were you a member of the board? And if the answer is yes, then you're just as liable as the person who made the motion. From a legal perspective, you're either a member of the board or you are not. And in fact, to really drive this point home, it's important to understand that as board members, you are accountable and liable for decisions made by your board at meetings, even if you were not present at those meetings. So once again, from a legal perspective, the board is a singular entity. From a functional perspective, however, we see many boards who don't behave this way. Many CEOs will say, in moments of candor, I don't know what my board expects me to do. I have 15 board members, and I'm hearing 3 or 4 different perspectives from the board. Or the board will make a decision, but then 3 or 4 board members will talk to me in the parking lot and say, don't do that or do it this way. Now, that's not effective governance. So one of the great challenges from a board perspective is to make certain that your message to fill in the blank, the CEO, the medical staff, the community, is a single message which all board members support and all board members are giving consistently. Next, related to these 2 points, we come to the third aspect of what makes boards unique, and that is that the authority of the board derives from the whole, not from any individual member. So put another way, let's say that you made me a member of your board. What is my authority as a board member? And the answer is 0. I can vote, but the authority of the board derives from the board as a whole. I have no authority whatsoever. I cannot pick up the phone and give a direction to the chief executive officer or make a promise to a member of the community that the board will or will not do something, and yet many board members do both of those, and that's inappropriate governance. Only the board can give a direction to the chief executive officer or terminate the employment of a CEO. And so it's very, very important, and that brings us back to that notion of I'm a member of a group, and I influence what the group does. But as a member of the group, I cannot act on behalf of the group, nor can I speak on behalf of the group unless I am specifically authorized to do so. So those are 3 key points which many boards run afoul of because they don't behave this way. Number 1, you'll see many board members meeting outside the context of a meeting and trying to frame a perspective. You want to do this with the whole board together. You find board members as individuals acting on behalf of the board and trying to give direction on behalf of the board. And all 3 of those are completely inappropriate. Now let's go to the next aspect, which is a phrase that I'm sure many of you have heard and will continue to hear during your tenure on the board, and that's the concept of the fiduciary duty of a board. And this is a very, very important concept, and from this flows the legal duties of governance. Now, fiduciary duty will vary somewhat depending on what state you're in. So to get, and also depending on the type of organization that your rural hospital is. So, for example, if you're a private, not-for-profit 501c3, and that's a term used in the Internal Revenue Service Code to designate a tax-exempt entity, then you will have a certain type of fiduciary duty. If you're a public, district, or county hospital, you will have similar but slightly different fiduciary duties depending upon the law. So I'm going to give you here kind of a broad overview of the most common fiduciary duties, but it's very important that you, with your hospital legal counsel, get the very specific, state-specific, and organizational-specific understanding of your fiduciary duty. But fiduciary duty is generally regarded as comprising three very specific legal duties. Number one, the duty of care. Number two, the duty of loyalty. And number three, the duty of obedience. So let's examine each of these in brief detail. And each one of these is worthy of a 1-hour in-service board education program so that the board is fully versed on this. So I emphasize, I'm just giving you a summary here. The duty of care. The duty of care says when you're on a board, you are legally required to exercise the same care in the oversight of all of the activities of the corporation. And that's a really important point. Your duty of care is not limited to finance. And many board members think fiduciary is a synonym for financial. It is not. You're just as responsible under the duty of care for quality, for cybersecurity, for human resources as you are for finance. So the duty of care requires that a board member exercise the same care in the oversight of all of the activities of the corporation that the legal, reasonable person would have been expected to exercise in that situation. So what does that mean? Does that mean you can't make a mistake? You've got to delve down into the bowels of the organization and count the paper clips? No, not at all. The key to the duty of care is that you must engage in due inquiry. The duty of care relates to the process of making decisions and how the board acts, not so much on the results, because boards are protected by a legal rule called the business judgment rule, which says just because the board made a bad decision does not mean it's liable. However, if you made a bad decision and it wasn't based on good process, you didn't follow the duty of care, then you may in fact be liable. So what is this notion of kind of the exercise of due oversight? So first of all, I emphasize again, you must exercise this duty of care in the oversight of all functions of the organization. One is not more important than the other. Secondly, the duty of care basically means you've got to be ready to do the work, knowledgeable, and ready to decide. You've got to have evidence that you have gotten educated about the specific topic that you're making a decision about. So if you're unfamiliar with a topic, you should ask for education. You can certainly seek expert advice, but just because the expert gives you an opinion doesn't mean you're obligated to follow that opinion. You need to ask questions and expect substantive answers to those questions. And a good source of fulfilling the duty of care is when the board seeks multiple sources of information. So an example, if the board is considering a decision and the only source of information they have is, let's say, from the CEO makes a recommendation that the board make a decision, you may want to get other sources of information. The same is true if a medical executive committee makes a recommendation or if a board committee makes a recommendation. So the duty of care really relates to asking questions, seeking multiple sources of information, getting educated about the topic before you make the decision. The next duty of care is the duty of loyalty. The next fiduciary duty is the duty of loyalty. And this is one of the most difficult duties to fulfill because the duty of loyalty basically says when you're a member of a hospital board, you must always act in the best interest of the hospital. You must always act in the best interest of the corporation, even if doing so will be harmful to your business or to your relationships. In other words, if there's ever tension between what's good for the organization and what's good for you as an individual board member, you must always place the best interest of the organization above the personal or business best interests of yourself or any other board member. Now, the way many boards get in trouble here is that they will rely on we're all reasonable people. They'll rely on the good graces of people to fulfill the duty of care. And that's not the way you want to fulfill this duty. The way you want to fulfill it is through policies and defined processes. So, for example, conflict of interest policies, confidentiality policies, disclosure policies. Those are the key policies to make certain that the board is acting solely in the best interests of the organization. That it requires, if you think you have a conflict or a duality of interest, that might influence your decision. Let's say you have a relative who works for the hospital, and the hospital is considering layoffs. That could put you in a very challenging situation. So the key is to disclose that. You also, once you disclose it, good conflict policies will have recusal policies, so that if the board determines, and that's the key issue here, the individual board member does not determine whether they have a conflict or not. If there's any implication or inference that there may be a conflict, the board member discloses this, and the board or a board committee then makes the determination. So if I have a child, an adult child who works for the organization and we're considering layoffs, or if my spouse is a physician and the physician in question is coming up for credentialing, and I say, gee, is this a conflict? I can say, I just wanted to disclose this. I don't think it's a conflict, but I want you to be aware of it. The board then makes a determination. And the board might say, no, Jamie, we believe this is a conflict, and so we're going to recuse you. You cannot be in the board meeting room when we're discussing the issue or when we're making a decision about the issue. And so you must know and be willing to follow the recusal policy. Now, for many of you who come from public district or county authority boards, you can't recuse. You can't follow a recusal policy. And so the whole issue of duty of loyalty takes a different spin if you are from a small rural facility, which is a public county or district organization. And once again, you'll have to chat with your legal counsel to get a specific understanding of the implications and the reach of the duty of loyalty for that type of organization. The other aspect of the duty of loyalty is what's called the usurpation of corporate opportunity aspect, and that is you are not allowed to use any knowledge you get as a board member for personal or business gain. So if you're on the board, let's say, and you hear that there's a new exit that's going to be opening off the interstate, and the CEO says, and there are 3 parcels of property near that exit that are for sale, and we're interested in buying parcel A because we can set up an urgent care center, just for the sake of argument, clearly it would be a conflict if you went out and then bought parcel A, because you'd be usurping the corporate opportunity to do that. So that's just a gross violation of the duty of loyalty. However, you may be surprised to know that if you go out and buy parcel B or C, even though the hospital has no intention of buying that, that could also be a violation of the duty of loyalty, because the only way that you found out that parcel B or C were up for sale was because you are a member of the board. Now, if it, a week later is published in the newspapers and then it becomes public knowledge, then it's very likely you would be able to act on that information. But you cannot act on information that you got solely because you're a member of the board for personal or business benefit. And that's another way of saying you're not on this board to benefit yourself, your family, your friends. You're on this board to benefit the organization, to help govern it in a way which is consistent with its mission. And that brings us to the third fiduciary duty, which is the duty of obedience. And just as it sounds, the duty of obedience requires that board members must obey. They have to obey the law, the rules, but they also have to obey if you are a private, not-for-profit charitable institution, a 501c3 organization. The highest fiduciary duty, the highest responsibility, is what's called the duty of obedience to charitable purpose. The reason that organization exists is not to make money. It's not to be a major source of employment. It's to fulfill the mission of the organization, which the Internal Revenue Service determined was of value enough to the community that it made you eligible to be tax exempt. And from that flows the greatest fiduciary duty for boards, to make sure that you are focused on accomplishing the mission. But the duty of obedience also requires that you follow whatever state non-for-profit or public corporation act exists in your state, or if you're a for-profit entity, the for-profit. And in addition, and this is something many board members are not aware of, your hospital bylaws and your board policies and procedures are also legally enforceable standards of care, and under the fiduciary duty of obedience, you are legally required to follow those bylaws. So if you have a set of bylaws, and I encounter this all the time, which are antiquated and you don't want to do them anymore, and you can't just behave differently, you must amend the bylaws. And so this is something that good boards will do once every year or so. They'll do a kind of internal policy and practices review where they look at their bylaws and then they look at their behavior to make certain that the way they're behaving is consistent with their bylaws. So, for example, if your bylaws say you have to operate 5 committees and you're only operating 3 committees, you're in violation of the bylaws and technically are in violation of the fiduciary duty of obedience. So you have 2 choices in that situation. Change your bylaws so that it just reflects the 3 committees which are meeting, or change the way you're behaving so that you now operate with 5 committees as specified in the bylaws. But you want your documents to be very consistent with your practices. So that's what's meant, and again, very broad kind of gross summary of fiduciary duty. But that's what's meant by fiduciary duty: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. And once again, I encourage you to check to see any variation based on your state or based on the type of organization that you are governing. So let's go on now and think about when boards don't work well, why don't they work well? And what I call this visual is, I call this the 7 deadly sins of ineffective governance. And the more of these you have, the less effectively you'll be able to govern effectively. So the first one is a very counterintuitive one, and that's representational governance. And representational governance is where people are chosen structurally or functionally believe that their purpose on the board is to represent a constituency group or a perspective. And that is not the case. In fact, representational governance is often the antithesis of integrated system thinking governance. Everyone is on the board for the same reason, and that is to work to accomplish the mission. And that is why the second deadly sin of ineffective governance is lack of mission focus. And so these 2 tend to go in a self-reinforcing negative feedback loop. The less a mission focus the board has, the more likely it will regress to representational governance. The third deadly sin is the tendency for boards to resist change rather than to try to lead it. And healthcare is changing so very dramatically. And what's an example of this is many boards will say, well, our job is to keep the hospital in this town because there's always been a hospital in this town. And you may be able to do that, you may not. But if that's your sole focus, you may not see opportunities to do things which then help you accomplish the broader purpose. It's going to be very, very difficult for us to keep things the way they've always been. And so, again, thinking about this relative to the first deadly sin, is the job of the board to represent the past, or is it to lead to the future? And I would argue it's to lead to the future. Fourth is governance information, and the quality of governance that a board manifests can never exceed the quality of information that it gets. So good boards are always tweaking and fine-tuning the information that they receive to make sure it is consistent with their strategy and that it leads them into the future. Ineffective boards frequently get the same information year after year after year, and the information becomes stale because it's focused on monitoring the past as opposed to leading to the future. So one of the oversight responsibilities of a board is to make certain that the information it's receiving from management, from the board committees, from the medical staff, is appropriate to the mission and to the strategic direction of the organization. Now, number 5 is kind of challenging to many people out there, reluctance to remove non-performing board members. And some of you out there can't do this. If you come from a public district, county authority hospital, the ability of the board to remove one of its members likely is an authority that you do not have. But if you're from a private organization, a 501c3 organization, you likely do have this responsibility. And what this speaks to is the kind of two structural bookends that help frame really effective governance is that a board can select its own members, but a board can also remove its own members. And the intent here is not to go out and intentionally kick people off the board, but it's to have rules. In other words, what am I expected to do as a board member, and what may I not do? And so many boards don't have rules, and so as a result, they basically rely on individual board members to express their own personal judgment about what's appropriate or what's not appropriate. And these are the boards who frequently will get in trouble. Good boards say these are our rules, and we expect everybody to follow them. And then the boards that have the ability to do so will say, and if you break these rules, we will remove you from the board, or we will not reappoint you to a successive term. Sixth deadly sin is cumbersome, outmoded governance structures, inappropriate committees, too many boards. So really, good boards control their structures, and ineffective boards tend to allow their structures to control them. And then the last deadly sin of ineffective governance is lack of job descriptions. Really good boards will have written job descriptions for the board member, for the board chair, for the committees, and for the committee chairs, so that they avoid what's called personality-driven governance and subscribe to policy and principle-based governance. And all of this is key to be able to have the board organize around a common belief system. And these are regarded as kind of three critical foundational leadership questions for the board. What do we believe? Not what do I believe versus what you believe. But as two board members with perhaps very different belief systems serving on the same board, we are both expected to subsume our individual views to the shared view of the board as codified in the mission. So number one is what do we believe? Number two, whom do we serve? You're going to have multiple customers. And as Peter Drucker said, the only way you can serve multiple customers equally well is if you serve them equally badly. So good boards will have a prioritized set of customers. We have multiple customers. We serve our patients, our families, our physicians, our employees, our community, the payers. Well, all right, great. In what order? So if the interests of two of those groups comes into conflict and you cannot serve them well, who takes precedence and why? And that is followed consistently, as opposed to making different situations in different decisions in different situations. And that's situational leadership, which you want to try to avoid. That's where boards basically improvise their ethics to justify the indulgence of their desires in a particular situation. Good boards make consistent, predictable situations because they're applying a common belief system and a common framework of who their most important customers are. So what's an example? Patients always come first. Some boards will take that and say, if there's ever a conflict between our multiple customers, the patient always comes first. And you may say, well, we don't want to do that. Fine. What's your prioritization? And then third, once you've asked and answered these first two questions, then and only then can you say, all right, what is it that we do as a board? And that brings us to controlling some of the specific levers of effective governance. And if you really want to be simplistic about it, there are only 4 or 5 things you can control: your time, your agenda, what information you receive, the board structures, and then that will enable you to set policy and strategy. Now, clearly, that last lever, setting effective policy and robust strategy, is the key aspect of governance. But you can't expect to be able to control that if you're not effectively controlling those first 4. So really good boards will create some type of a governance model. And what I've done is tried to synthesize the ones that are out there to give you an idea of what a governance model might look like. You start with the mission of the organization. The mission helps you generate the strategic plan. And if it's more than a one-year strategic plan, that then tends to get broken down into annual goals and objectives. These then form the basis for the CEO performance objectives, but they should also form the basis for annual board goals and objectives. And really good boards will have annual board goals and objectives. And what you can see here is if you do this, you have very specifically and practically answered the perennial question, what's the difference between governance and management? if you have CEO performance objectives for 2019, and if you have board goals and objectives for 2019, you have answered the question, what do we expect management to do? What do we expect the board to do? And you have a very practical, clear differentiation of the role of management from governance. The board goals and objectives can then be used to influence or determine what committees you will have, determine what the work plans are for the committees. They also are used to determine the board agenda for the coming year. So as the board goals and objectives change from year to year, the agenda of the board meeting changes from year to year, as does the information that the board receives. And this then can influence related governance issues like continuing education curricula for the board or new board criteria for selecting new board members. Now, what ties it all together is evaluation. The CEO performance objectives should form the basis for the CEO performance evaluation. And by the same token, the board goals and objectives should form the basis for the annual board self-evaluation. And if you perform both of these processes simultaneously, at the same time you're developing the CEO performance objectives, you're also developing the board goals and objectives. The board goals and objectives. And you do the CEO performance evaluation at the same time you're doing the board self-evaluation. It really shows you this leadership link and continuum. So that's an example of one governance model. I call that the effective governance pyramid. But there are others out there. But really good boards have some type of a model which controls those levers of effective governance and puts them all together. And that then brings us to a very interesting point. When you do this, it kind of gets to a very interesting question, which is, what is the role of the board in terms of supporting the CEO? And the answer is, you want to follow this, kind of green language. You want to support the decisions and the strategy and support the CEO, but only after there has been productive disagreement. So look at the red at the bottom of this visual, which is the job of the board is really to be a sparring partner with the CEO. So before you go out to the public, if the CEO brings you an idea, the job of the board is to be loyal dissent, to critically question, to be the sparring partner, to have what's called productive disagreement, so that once you get past that disagreement, you now can speak with one voice and support the CEO. And here's an example of that. Alfred Sloan, when he was chair of General Motors and also their CEO, brought a proposal to his board, and the board immediately approved it. And he said to the board, gentlemen, I take it that we're in complete agreement on the decision here. Then I propose that we postpone further discussion to give ourselves time to develop disagreement and perhaps gain some understanding of what the decision is all about. So really good boards will understand that understanding an issue comes from debate and respectful dissent. And there's nothing wrong with disagreeing as long as it's done at the appropriate time, not after decisions have been approved or strategy has been set, but when you're in the stage of debating those issues. So once again, there's a very interesting dichotomy in board function. When we are first considering a decision or a strategy, it's okay to debate, to dissent, to disagree. Once the board has approved a decision or a strategy, it is not okay to dissent or disagree. The board must speak with one voice. And so this brings us to the point where many of you may be acting in a way that's consonant with what I've described, and that's great, but the environment is changing so dramatically that what was effective governance 10 years ago may well be felonious governance today. So I bring you a thesis which you would do well to think about, and that is the quality of governance that was sufficient to get your organization where it is today will likely be insufficient to get it where it needs to be tomorrow. And so that brings us to one of the key characteristics of really good boards, which is that they're always tweaking and tinkering. They're always trying something. Let's do this, let's do that. Oh, that didn't work, let's drop it. That worked, let's keep it. They try to stay out of a set it and forget it mode. And what's indicative of that set it and forget it mode? When I'm consulting with boards, I'll frequently ask the question, why do you do that way, whatever that is, your board meetings, your committee structure, whatever it is. And the single most common answer I get to that question is because we've always done it that way, and it's always worked. Well, what happens if it stops working? And good boards are always trying to stay ahead of that curve. So let's examine a couple of other issues before we open up for some questions or come to the conclusion of this webinar. We've got tons of research which show that a group of independent people with access to good information and good process will consistently make better decisions about an issue than the most intelligent individual or an expert can. Now, that's very counterintuitive, but that's what the data shows, that a good group of people, with good information and good process. And why did I highlight both of those? Because if I ask you if you could only have one of those, which is more important? And what's interesting is the research shows that good process is more important than good information. That good process will trump bad information, but that good information will not trump bad decision-making process. Now, that's very, very counterintuitive. I personally believe that if you gave me great information, I'd be able to make a perfect decision. But if I'm using a bad decision-making process, I won't. So you as a board have to make sure you have good processes to make decisions and that you get good information. And so many boards don't. So how come they don't behave this way? And there are a couple of reasons why, and some of these are research-based and some are tongue-in-cheek. Some boards, especially boards from small rural communities where everybody lives and works together and knows everybody outside the community, these types of boards frequently will value harmony more than they do effectiveness and creativity, meaning it's more important than we get along than it is we ask challenging questions or perhaps have difficult debates or difficult conversations. And the latter is obviously more important and more consistent with the fiduciary duty of a board. The second one, how come when boards get together frequently it seems as though their intelligent quotient has declined? Now, that's obviously tongue-in-cheek. But there is some experiential truth in that. The third one, never underestimate the power of bad ideas, especially in groups, is actually research-based. There are two phenomena, decision fatigue and anchoring, which can take something which everyone sees as a bad idea and make it the idea which is chosen by the board when they get tired and when it's the only thing they can agree on that this is a bad idea. And this comes from this new fascinating field called decision theory. And then last, there is no joy quite so profound as being totally clueless. And once again, that's tongue-in-cheek. But the first and the third of these, in fact, are research-based. And so in addition to kind of making sure that the ship is steady, you also need to look to the future. And it's important to understand that the function of the board may change depending upon the environment in which the hospital that the board is governing is in. And in a stable environment where the past inexorably flows into and predicts the future, the job of the board is to keep things the way they've always been. And that's the environment that many of us have come from. But I would argue, and others would argue, that healthcare is now in a very disjointed, if not revolutionary environment. And here, according to Max De Pree, the job of the board is to redefine reality, is to say, well, gee, if we can't maintain a full-service hospital in this community anymore, how do we redefine a reality so that our organization still exists to meet a mission and to serve the needs of the community in the best way we can in an era of diminished resources? But what this really speaks to is this notion that the board is a leader, and the definition of leadership that I like the most is getting me to do something if I'm a member of your medical staff or if I'm an employee that I've always wanted to do, that I'm good at doing. That's not leadership. Getting me to do something I don't want to do, that I don't know how to do, that I'm frightened of doing, that's really leadership. And so one of the great directions that boards are moving in is something from system theory, which is called the regulation of distress. It's not your job to keep everybody happy, because if everybody's happy, odds are you are not effectively getting ready to deal with the revolutionary change which is coming down your pike. It's your job to push people to the edge of their comfort zone and regulate the distress that they're experiencing so that they can help move the organization forward just ahead of the environmental change that is required. And to do this brings us to a concept which we'll talk about for a few minutes and then conclude, and this is this notion as governance and leadership. that was developed by a professor at Harvard named Richard Chait. And he talks about three modes of governance. And this is different. The first one is different than fiduciary duty. He uses the term a little bit differently. But he talks about three modes of governance: fiduciary, strategic, and generative. And so what's the difference? Fiduciary governance in his model is where the board checks the boxes, dots the I's, cross the T's. It's where you're overseeing operations, ensuring legal compliance, financial integrity, and so on. The strategic mode of governance is when you're scanning with staff internal and external environments and coming up with strategic plans as we know them. But the newer one that relates more to the revolutionary change is the generative mode. That's when you are really trying to discern, frame, and confront challenges that are more rooted in values, traditions, and beliefs, and try to make sense out of what's going on and frame the problems which are emerging. So let's examine each of these in a little bit more detail. In the fiduciary mode, the board does what it's legally required to do. You must make certain that you comply with the conditions of participation with Medicare. You must make certain that you satisfy the standards of the Joint Commission if you choose to be accredited by the Joint Commission. And you can do that, but the organization can still get in trouble. So if you don't do this, you'll get in trouble. But just because you do this does not mean you will be successful. The strategic mode, that's when you're basically kind of going from a known past to a known future to come up with how you're going to allocate your resources, services, and programs. But the generative mode is when the board is engaging in very deep inquiry, asking the question behind the question, trying to come up with root causes and generating alternatives and new ideas, which may then turn into strategy in the near future. So once again, fiduciary duty, you're meeting regulatory requirements, protecting assets, assuring that the resources are used in the pursuit of mission. You're dotting I's, crossing T's, checking boxes. The strategic mode it typically tends to be incremental, tends to be logical, and tends to be goal-based. And most of the time here is spent on getting everybody on the same page. The generative mode is when you're doing the redefinition of the future. You're asking the questions behind the questions. It's going to reshape the thinking in the other two modes. It's where you're looking for cues and clues. This type of thinking tends to be very nonlinear and is frequently disruptive to the organization. So, you could ask the question, why are rural hospitals closing around the country? And what would happen if, the hospital in our community closed? That's a very disruptive question. And that's when you're asking the question behind the question, which may be very uncomfortable, but which then may frame issues which turn into strategies which help ensure that your organization, perhaps in a different form, will continue to exist into the future to be able to fulfill your mission. So the concept here is you've got to do all three. So boards will kind of think and work in three different modes. All three of them serve different important purposes. But the value that your board adds to the organization increases as you become proficient in all three modes and as you begin to spend more of your time in the generative mode. And so, really good boards will say, okay, what mode are we in? All right, we're in the fiduciary mode. We have to do this in order to satisfy a regulatory requirement. We're in a strategic mode. We're trying to figure out the best way to respond to a change in the payment system. We're in the generative mode. We're asking these big picture challenging questions which aren't going to result in a very specific decision at this meeting and probably not for the next year or two. So to summarize, generative thinking tries to make sense of circumstances. You consider alternative hypotheses. It puts perceived problems or opportunities in a new light. And then it will spawn policy, strategy, and decision-making for the board. So to tie this all up, let's consider, what's a key? Because you remember one of the things we first started with was that a board only exists when it is meeting. And if that's the case, what that means is that really effective boards have to have really effective meetings. And so you'll see that really good boards will use many or all of these. They'll have a consent agenda, which is designed to free up time so the board can do things that need to be done but which are not worthy of talking about during the board meeting. they'll have an agenda which is clearly linked to strategy, board goals, and objective, as I defined in that governance pyramid model I described to you. The board makes it very clear to its committees, to the CEO, and to the medical staff, we know how to read and we know how to listen. Do not ask us to do both. And what I mean by that is presentations made during a board meeting should never replicate written reports which have been given to the board. If you've given the board a report to review, it reviews the report. Rather than giving a verbal report, which just simply duplicates the material, you should be mindful of the board's time and say something like, I know you've all read the report, any questions? But you'd be amazed how many boards allow their time to be wasted because of this. Fourth is decision sequencing. Good boards will ask their CEOs, their committees, and the medical staff, never ask us to make a major decision at the same board meeting where the issue is first presented. We want it presented. We want to be able to talk about it, think about it, ask questions, and then sleep on it, and then maybe make the decision at the next or a subsequent meeting. Fifth, they always think about who can be in the room. Is it just board members? Is it management? Is it medical staff? When can a board go into executive session? Why would it do that? Sixth, they make time for deep dive generative mode discussions at all board meetings. And seventh, they have a mechanism to evaluate the board meeting immediately after the meeting took place to shorten the feedback loop between the evaluation of the activity and the improvement of the activity. And so let me end right before we take some questions with that visual I gave you before, which is the quality of governance that was sufficient to get your organization where it is today will be insufficient to get it where it needs to be tomorrow. So we've talked about some of the kind of core characteristics of Hospital Boards 101, but this hopefully is just a start as you begin your wonderful journey into governance. And once again, thank you so very much for doing what I think is one of the most important volunteer jobs in America today, which is helping to govern America's hospitals. Cassidy, let me turn it back to you to see if we have any questions.
We do have a couple of questions.
Oh, all right, let's hear them.
And you are correct. This will be available. We have recorded this webinar, and it will be available on the CORE website, optimizingruralhealth.org, and we will send it out after the webinar. But I would encourage everyone at this time, if you have questions, to send them in the chat box, either privately to myself, Cassidy Avila, or publicly to the group. But the first question that we had that came in says, you mentioned multiple in-services are needed to cover loyalty and obedience. Where can I go to get those in-services?
That's a great question, and really good boards routinely get continuing governance education. So as part of a new board member orientation and as part of a board retreat, your board should be doing this for the local board. So, you have probably an attorney who helps support hospital function. That attorney could be the source of education about the fiduciary duty in your state and for your type of organization. In addition, state hospital associations, other groups like CORE, do continuing education on these topics. There are many publications. The American Hospital Association has a wonderful repository on its website, Trustee Insights, where they have webinars and also publications that go into fiduciary duties in greater length. The good news here is that, if you Google it, if you just Google fiduciary duty of a hospital board member, you will see dozens of resources which are publicly available. But everyone on your board should be aware of this. So if your board is not orienting its new board members or is not on a regular basis doing some, kind of continuing education for the board, you should bring that up. And as that's not even a best governance practice. That's just a good governance practice.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question is, can you offer best practices for encouraging a hospital board to get training and education when they are resistant or don't feel they need education?
Everybody needs education, and if a board doesn't think it needs education, that represents a very serious problem, because to believe that the board can be current with everything that's going on in healthcare is hubris at its worst. What many boards will do is they will have a kind of mandatory continuing governance education requirement pursuant to term renewal. Other boards will build in an education component as part of a board agenda meeting. So you have a meeting and you devote 20 minutes of every meeting to a review of a particular issue. In addition, many boards have annual board retreats where they build in real-time education, which is relevant to your type of organization, into the retreat. If your board is not getting educated, it cannot be a best practices board. Things are changing so very dramatically. The laws are changing. The exposure to liability is changing. The quality issues, the financial issues are changing. It's crucially important that the board builds this into its routine function. And then lastly, if you have a governance committee of the board whose job is to oversee continuing governance improvement efforts, typically they will be in charge of the continuing governance education. So those are kind of a multitude of ways you should be doing it. But a board who is resistant to getting education is a great big red flashing danger sign of ineffective governance. That's not a board I would want to belong to just simply because, A, it couldn't be a good board, and B, that's the type of board that's likely to be involved in an organizational failure or some type of governance disaster.
Great. Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions, but I will give you guys a few minutes. This is a great opportunity to ask Mr. Orlikoff questions. And so while I give you a few moments, I just want to plug our website again. You can view past webinars and get information on upcoming webinars at optimizingruralhealth.org. We will be sending out an email following this webinar. We'll include the slides as well as a link to our website and also a short 1-minute survey. So we would really appreciate it if you would just take that 60 seconds to complete that survey and let us know what you thought about today's webinar, and just also maybe drop in a few topics that you would like to see future webinars on. So going back to the chat box, I don't see any other questions, Mr. Orlikoff, at this time. But if you have something that comes up, feel free to email us. We appreciate your time and your expertise, and we appreciate everyone that attended the call today. Thanks you so much.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all.